Let's take a look at the texture analysis exercise. This is the first exercise in which we really dig into actual detail rather than focusing on general mark making or constructing forms. And a lot of students do struggle with it, but the important thing to take away from this and to remember is that this exercise is an introduction to a concept. I don't expect you to know anything about drawing texture, about observational drawing, about really absorbing the information that you see. And if you make a horrible mess of it, that's completely fine. This is just an opportunity for you to expose yourself to this kind of way of thinking so that your brain can start turning its gears in this direction. Because before you actually know what it's like to try and observe something, you're going to have no idea of how to approach it. So having it introduced now means that over time you'll gradually become more comfortable with it, especially as you practice it. But even just the matter of being introduced to it shows your brain that this is a challenge that exists for you to tackle eventually. So we are going to be drawing from a piece of reference that I got. Usually with these kinds of demos, I think about doing things like pebbles and scales because they're generally pretty easy. I was looking through a student's homework and I saw that they had an image of some fried chicken, and looking at the skin on it was actually pretty interesting. So this is the rosemary brined buttermilk fried chicken from epicurious.com. It's a recipe website, so if it makes you hungry, you can go check that out. This exercise involves creating a page that has 3 rows that look like this. So the page itself is going to look something like, you got your page, probably have it in landscape orientation, and you've got it split up into 3 rows. And each row has 2 squares. And you can draw all of this with a ruler. You don't have to freehand this. So 2 squares and a longer rectangle. And this is basically going to be, each row will be dedicated to a different texture. So over here, this first square is going to be dedicated to doing an actual direct observational study of your reference image. You don't have to draw the whole thing. You can focus in on a specific area, like maybe I just want to draw this. But the point is to focus only on drawing what you see. And as you do that, you can write notes in this second square. So we can just write that this is a study. It's a direct study where we're not really processing any of the information that we're seeing. We're just focusing on carrying over what we see. And then these are just for notes. And then I'll get into the last rectangle after we're done this. So I am going to, and we're doing this with a fine liner, so it's all in ink, meaning, don't go crazy on drawing outlines because then you're going to have those outlines sitting there in the for the whole time. So I try and focus in on the shadows that I see. And it's totally fine if this doesn't come out entirely accurately. The process itself is supposed to just make you think about what it is you're seeing. When you're forced to draw something, it really does make you try and process it differently than if you were just to look at it. And since we're working in purely black and white, we're really limited in terms of like what shadows do we decide are going to fall within our threshold, because we can't draw every single teeny tiny shadow because they're all going to come out with the same kind of weight. And try and focus in on, you have to keep a general sense of the overall space that you're working in, so that say this chunk here doesn't end up being way over here, because then it's proportionally it's not in the right place. But generally, I still want you to focus quite heavily on small sections. Don't try and just, you know, record all the information into your memory from here and then draw the whole thing. You focus on tiny pieces, like maybe you're looking at this, and then you draw those lines in your drawing, and then you go back to studying this and find another small piece of information to carry over. And remember, we are not drawing any outlines. And don't worry too much about if you start making mistakes, like trying to squeeze things in. Like you'll notice here, these details that I've drawn here are about at this height, so I haven't left enough room for the rest of this stuff, and I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to let it cut off. I've accepted that my study is not going to be perfectly accurate. It's just going to be as close as I can get it for now. You'll notice that in these textures, there's a lot of different levels of detail. So on one hand, you might, pick up on these big shadows here, and you might just focus on those, like this one here. But then if you look really closely, you get all these tinier shadows that are much more subtle. And so you have to decide where your cutoff is. Like, which shadows do you ignore and which shadows do you pay attention to? And also, these shadows are not always going to be of the same kind of, like, these are much sharper shadows here because there's a chunk of form that is sticking out and it is a distance above the surface beneath it. Whereas you've got these that are more like just little ripples. So it's just a tiny bump along the surface, leaving a much smaller, lighter shadow. I don't want this video to take too long here, so I'm going to try and speed this up, and maybe I'll just do a generally rougher job. There's definitely value in you seeing me doing this, but having you watch the whole bloody thing is going to be a bit of a waste. People have generally complained about the length of my videos in the past, and so I've been trying this round to kind of keep that lower. Just focus on the major points and then let people go do their work. There is a lot of value in letting yourself be bolder with your shadows. Often we'll just be very noodly and quietly just try and capture the smaller shadows, just teeny things, but really we can go in and just chunk out a whole big bold shadow, make it nice and deep. And when you see little spots that are like these, you see this black spot here, you see another one here, and they're all over the place. Oftentimes, your brain will see them and be like, oh, that's a black spot. I can just fill it in with black. But you wouldn't do that for any other color that you're seeing. You wouldn't do it for your, the orange skin. You wouldn't do it for anything else. It's just that your brain jumps on the fact that it's black and you say, oh, I have a black pen. I can do that. Don't go playing favorites with colors. Treat it all like the entire form is a flat gray. And so that way you can start separating out, well, what of this is actually a shadow that I'm supposed to capture and which parts are just discoloration. And if it's just discoloration, it's just a local color for that surface, and it doesn't actually have to do with the forms that we're trying to suggest exist. So ignore all that local color information and just focus on the forms. I'm starting to get a little bit mixed up in terms of what's where, and that will happen a lot. At some point, you may find yourself just, because the four corners have started to get a little bit disjointed, you could have started in the center and radiated out, but, I didn't. So as it starts to get disjointed, you may just decide to start focusing on individual components and placing them, and then just, noodling the parts that are in between to be a little bit more approximate. You will often find that drawing these kinds of studies with color, if you're doing digital painting or even painting with, actual paint like gouache or watercolor or oil, uh, when you've got that full range of color and tone, it's a lot easier, really, to capture textures in a way that looks closer to what it's supposed to be. But here, we're working so strictly with flat black and full white and nothing in between that we just have to learn so much about the shadows that we see. And it becomes a really effective exercise, even if the result doesn't come out entirely looking as you might have hoped it would. But it is immensely valuable. So it kind of comes down to remembering that every exercise that we're doing is not intended to create a pretty picture in the end. It's intended to teach us something about the skills that we're trying to develop. And so oftentimes, if something is, if the focus is on making something pretty, then you're going to be taking some routes and some choices that maybe won't be as educationally valuable. You're sacrificing one gain, and that's the end result, for something else. And that's something I need to remind students of quite frequently. All right, I'm just going to move on from this. So let's take some quick notes. You can do this while you're actually drawing the texture, but I got a little bit caught up in just strictly observing, and I'll do the notes now. So, what do we see about these forms? There's a lot of big kind of protrusions. they stick out like, they cast large shadows. And they're balanced against the fact that there's a lot of these smaller kind of much more subtle is lagging a little bit. And so you get more of that like kind of gradual dissipation into like, so instead of just having a flat shadow, which most of our cast shadows are, you get a lot of smaller shadows that build up along the edge of it that kind of make it a little bit softer. So when you're drawing those softer shadows, you want to pick up on the fact that there are like all these little glistening pores on the skin because it's been, it's fried chicken, right? So it's got all that oil that's collected. And it is skin, of course. So, you can get a lot of these little spots, kind of stippling type textures where the pores themselves are casting tiny shadows. And now when you draw these, instead of drawing them as a circle, like that's obviously an enlarged version of it, but instead always remember that everything is still just a cast shadow. So if the light is coming this way, you want it to be like a little crescent moon where this side of it is being lit and then this side is not. So it's getting a shadow that kind of shapes itself like this. But of course, when you're drawing them so small, it can be quite tricky to do so. Keeping it in mind, don't like stamp your pen down and instead make everything a tiny stroke. And of course, those pores will collect together to form these, it's getting into the territory of being more form shading than cast shadows. But even when you're doing that, remember that you are denoting just a lower level of texture, where your major texture is these big cast shadows from all these big protrusions, but the smaller levels are just the finer, more subtler shadows that are being cast by smaller forms. And at the end of the day, when we, like all these textures that we're studying here are in order to give us some sort of a repeating flat black and white pattern that we can use instead of hatching. Because you know how I've mentioned this in the form shading video, that students will use hatching lines to create kind of a dense to sparse arrangement that makes it feel like it's going from dark to light. And so you can do that with cast shadows instead, and that way that shading is actually giving you more information about what the object is, what kind of texture it has, and you can sneak that in there. And that's actually what this exercise is all about, as you'll see in the next bit. So anyway, you can take more notes if you want, but that's fine for me. And generally what I want you to do is I want you to complete the studies, that's these columns. I want you to complete them first, meaning you do it for the first texture, then you do it for the second texture, then you do it for the third texture, and then you come back to these rectangles, which I'll explain now. The rectangles themselves are all about creating a gradient, just like the hatching, from dense and dark to sparse and light. I guess it's light and sparse. Wait, no, sparse and light. And so, like I said before, we are just reproducing the same effect that you get from hatching lines. So, this is something you may have seen a lot in shading for other drawing courses that focus more on pencil and charcoal and that sort of thing. Although not charcoal, I guess, but Pencil definitely uses a lot of hatching lines, so does ballpoint pen. And so they create this effect that, you've got more densely packed detail on this side and less here. And so it creates the illusion that as you step back and away from this, it creates the illusion that you're getting a shift in actual tone and value, meaning you're going from dark to light. You got your middle grays in here. And so we want to get that same impression, but using the information that we're pulling out of this image and out of what we learned from our textures and our notes, or from our study and our notes. So this, I shouldn't move this. This rectangle needs to have two things before we start, and that is a black thick bar on this end. The actual width doesn't matter that much, but it should be substantial enough that it's not just blending in with the original frame of this section. And so this is solid black. And on this side, we essentially have the same thing, but of course we can't really separate it out right now, where we have solid white. Nothing can go in either of these. Obviously, we can't erase back the ink that we've put here, but in here, we're not allowed to put any lines after this point. So all the ink that we draw has to stay in here in this transition zone. Oh, I guess you can't really see what I'm writing here. I'll just move this up then. There. Transition gradient zone, whatever. And the goal is to essentially take all that information and use it to build a gradient going from left to right. Now, we can't just draw what we've seen here. We can't take information directly from the texture because that's already got its own specific amounts of density in different areas. But we need to pull the information that is collected here, the kinds of patterns of shadow, and the actual awareness of the forms that exist here, like these protrusions versus the dips in the skin. And we use that to create our gradient. So generally what I will do is I will start in the middle, because that is where, all of this stuff is generally just a middle tone. It's where the bulk of your texture is. As you move out this way, the shadows are going to get so deep that it starts to overtake, it starts to cover up your texture. And then here it'll get so sparse that your texture is kind of just disappearing. And so at any point in this drawing, the viewer will understand that, oh, that surface has the same texture all the way through, but the way that it is drawn and the way the light is being made to shine on it impacts how those shadows actually appear. So we're changing how we draw the texture, but not what we're communicating. So I'm gonna just start capturing the big protrusions first. And I'm getting my shadows to kind of cast in this direction. So it's like there's a light source up here. Or I guess over here, really, if we're being accurate. So those shadows are going to be casting from... Actually, you know what? No, I'm going to do the opposite, because I want this part to be lit very much. And so I'm going to put my light source over here, and it's going to cast the shadows in the opposite direction. So that way it makes perfect sense for there to be more light on this side and none, and much less, and none, I guess, on this far left side. So I'm starting off with just drawing some big old chunks of fried chicken skin. And don't worry about things getting cut off on the top and the bottom, because you're just looking at an isolated strip of something larger. And remember, when you've got these little ripples, the shadows are only going to be falling on one side of it. You might get a little bit of the texture in certain places, but it's still the bulk of that shadow is going to be falling to the left. And every single mark, as always, is just a shadow. So if I had scales, I wouldn't be outlining each scale entirely. I'd be catching the shadows that they cast on each other. And so they'd be left open to flow across the gradient, rather than trapping your eye in each individual one. And if you're not sure what I exactly mean in saying that, then go back to the lesson page for texture and look at the video and the notes for the implicit versus explicit section. So I am going to be purposely deepening a lot of these shadows on the far left. But for now, I just want to kind of put the basic shadows down, and then you can always push your shadows further later on, but you can't really pull them back since we're working in ink. And since you guys are working in ink and I'm working digitally, I do want to simulate that. I've been hitting undo a few times, but it's been out of habit, so I'm trying to keep that at a minimum. Just deal with all the marks that I put down. So these big chunks of protrusions of skin where they get really crispy tend to be very hard. And so they've got these big kind of shadows inside them. Sometimes they have these kind of strong ridges. Every now and then, for some reason on this newer build of my PC, my Photoshop will just lock up for a few seconds to even a minute, where it refuses to make any marks, and then all of a sudden it catches up, like it's doing it right now. So that's a bit of a problem. But it's not enough to really hold me back. Just undo those marks and keep going. And so every single texture that you draw is going to be a different sort of a problem to solve. So you have all these particular features, and the problem is that you're still trying to make a gradient from light to dark, dark to light. And so the tools that you're given are going to be different from texture to texture. And you're just always you're basically trying to MacGyver your way into, if you don't understand that reference. It's an old TV show where a guy with a mullet would basically use simple little things that he found to get himself out of dangerous situations. Just like use duct tape and ingenuity. All right, I'm going to start kind of blending this big black bar back into the texture so that we can start getting our our gradient to actually do its job, rather than a lot of students forget and they just leave the black bar there, and so you get, like you can see right now, you get a very quick jump, and that's not what we want. We don't want to know where this border was. We want it to transition smoothly enough that it just becomes all one transitional gradient. You may want to use a a brush pen to kind of fill in the large black areas on this side. Um, Brush pens can be much harder to control, but if you use your main fine liner to just kind of draw in the shadow shapes and then fill them in with the brush pen, it can be easier to manage. And so on this side, we're really letting those shadows, even the little pores, to get much deeper and to kind of group together into their own clusters and shadow shapes, so that everything on this side, all the shadows on the left side are getting big and dark. Whereas over here, they're much, especially on this side, they're going to be much more subtle. Photoshop is starting to really give me some trouble. There we go. Okay. And so by leveraging all these tiny little pores and their shadows, we can kind of break up this strong flat edge. This video's already hit about 30 minutes. I don't expect anyone to sit through the whole thing, but maybe kind of fast forwarding through a lot of it. Although I do mention a lot of useful notes, but this is one of those things that I really can't make into a 5 or 10-minute video. All the lecture and conceptual stuff is easy because I can put together the all the diagrams and stuff ahead of time, but here the point is for you to actually see how I'm putting this texture together and what I'm thinking about. So I think I'm going to probably, for now, I'm going to shift over to the sparser end. This side will be definitely easier because, you don't get as deep shadows. The threshold for the shadows that actually do appear really gets high. So you're only going to get the shadows in the deepest cracks, especially as you're getting out here, or where different forms kind of connect together. So with that scale example, how is Photoshop doing? You back? No. Okay. So with the scale example, when you get, so your scales are kind of configured like this, right? But the deepest cracks are where these two scales meet and these scales meet. So you're going to end up with shadow that just kind of appears there and then disappears. And then maybe another one that appears here where it meets this other scale, and so on. So you end up with a lot more holes where your eye can just flow right through. I think I might end up ending this one just a little bit early, just because of how Photoshop is behaving. But let's see if I can just get a few more of these details in. Essentially, I've demonstrated all the major points here, which are, packing in the densest details on this side, and letting it get more and more sparse, really increasing the threshold of which shadows are allowed to actually show up and manifest as you move to the light side. So when you're doing this exercise, I'd continue to like build up your darks right up into, oh, my brush isn't working at all now. So just continue working up your darks right up into maybe this point, and then let it get kind of more even, so that this zone is more where you're drawing the level of texture that you might actually see in your photographs, and then here you let it get very sparse. Just, no outlines for anything, and just let it get very subtle. And remember about the fact that your textures have different levels of detail. So you've got your big stuff, the big shadows, and then you've got all these little pores that can be used very usefully to kind of make these deeper ends much darker without just going into big dark shadow shapes. Because if you have these little pores and little bumps that you're capturing, you can use them to break up shadows and those shadow edges a lot more into more interesting shapes, basically. So that is essentially how we tackle this exercise. Remember that when you're starting out, it's not going to be easy. It's a new concept. It's just an introduction, and you don't need to expect yourself to be able to perform at the level of someone who's been doing it for a very long time. These are not skills that you are born with. These are not skills that you have inherently. And in fact, human beings are by default very bad at capturing all of the detail that exists within whatever it is that they're seeing.